The thunder cracked overhead as Jackson Miller stood at the fresh grave, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a grief no man should bear at 28. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory was as unforgiving as the circumstances that had taken Sarah from him childbirth, something that should have brought life, not stolen it away along with their stillborn son. Rain began to fall, mingling with the tears on Jackson's weathered face. The other mourners had already departed, heading back to their homesteads before the storm worsened. Only Reverend Thompson remained, standing a respectful distance away beneath a black umbrella, allowing Jackson his final moments alone with the woman he'd promised to love for far longer than the 3 years they'd been granted. "I don't know how to do this without you," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking. The cold wind whipped around him, but he couldn't feel it. Couldn't feel much of anything except the hollow ache in his chest where his heart used to be. When he finally turned away from the grave, his boots sinking into the freshly turned earth, Reverend Thompson approached him. "You're welcome to stay in town tonight, son. The widow Jenkins has a spare room." Jackson shook his head. "Got cattle to tend. Can't leave the ranch, not even tonight." The truth was, he couldn't bear the thought of people's pity, their awkward condolences, their hushed whispers about the young widower. The ride back to his ranch was a blur. The 5 miles stretched endlessly before him as Rusty, his chestnut gelding, navigated the familiar trail. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture and the promise of more to come. By the time he crested the final hill overlooking his property, dusk had fallen. The ranch house Sarah had made into a home stood dark and silent. No lantern glowed in the window. No smoke rose from the chimney. No Sarah waiting on the porch with her bright smile and even brighter laugh. Jackson stabled Rusty, moving mechanically through the familiar chores. When he finally entered the house, the emptiness hit him like a physical blow. Sarah's sewing basket sat by her rocking chair. The quilt she'd been working on for the baby lay half-finished across the arm of the sofa. Her presence was everywhere, yet nowhere. He couldn't bring himself to light the lanterns. Instead, he sank into a chair in the darkness and let the grief wash over him in waves that threatened to drown him. The first weeks passed in a haze. Jackson worked himself to exhaustion during the daylight hours, collapsing into dreamless sleep at night. He spoke only when necessary to his cattle, to his horse, to himself, when the silence grew too oppressive. The neighbors stopped by with food and offers of help, but he turned them away with curt thanks. "You can't go on like this," Harold Parker told him bluntly one afternoon in late summer. The older rancher had ridden over to help mend a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. "Sarah wouldn't want it." Jackson drove another nail into the fence post with more force than necessary. "Don't tell me what my wife would want." Harold sighed, adjusting his hat against the bright August sun. "I'm not trying to tell you how to grieve, son. Just saying that eventually, you've got to start living again." "I am living," Jackson replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Existing, maybe? Surviving, barely. Judith and I were wondering if you might join us for Sunday dinner," Harold ventured. "Nothing fancy. Just a meal not cooked by your own hand for a change." Jackson started to refuse, the words of rejection ready on his tongue. But something in Harold's expression concern, not pity, made him pause. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Harold nodded, seeming to understand that was the best he'd get. "Judith's making apple pie. Just so you know." He glanced at the western sky. "Better head back. Looks like there might be another storm brewing." After Harold left, Jackson finished the fence repair and stood looking out across his land. 50 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy house, healthy cattle. He'd built it all for Sarah, for the family they planned to raise. Now it was just land and livestock, the promise of it all turned to dust. Sunday came, and Jackson surprised himself by washing up, putting on a clean shirt, and riding over to the Parker place. It was the first time he'd been properly social since the funeral, and the prospect made his stomach knot with anxiety. But he'd given his word, and if nothing else, Jackson Miller kept his promises. The Parker Ranch was larger than his own, with a sprawling 2-story house that Harold had built when he first settled in the territory 15 years earlier. As Jackson approached, he could see activity on the porch. Harold and Judith, and someone else he didn't recognize. "Jackson! You made it!" Harold called out, waving him over. "Come meet our daughter, Pearl. She just arrived from Boston last week." Jackson dismounted, tying Rusty to the hitching post. He removed his hat as he approached the porch, suddenly conscious of his sun-weathered face and the streaks of gray that had appeared in his dark hair since Sarah's passing. Pearl Parker stood beside her mother, and Jackson's first impression was of brightness. Not just her appearance, though she was certainly pretty with her chestnut hair and clear blue eyes. It was something in her bearing of vitality that seemed at odds with the harsh realities of frontier life. "Mr. Miller," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard so much about you. I'm very sorry about your wife." Her voice held genuine compassion without the cloying sympathy he'd come to dread. Jackson took her offered hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Thank you, Miss Parker. Welcome to Montana. Pearl's come to teach at the new schoolhouse in town," Judith explained, ushering them all inside. "First time we've had a proper school in these parts. Not that we have many children yet," Harold added, "but the territory's growing. Soon enough we'll need more than one teacher, I expect." Pearl smiled. "For now, I'm just grateful for the opportunity. After 2 years of teaching in Boston, I was ready for something different. And we're grateful to have her home, even if it's only temporary," Judith said, leading them into the dining room where the table was set with her good china. The meal was simple but hearty: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Judith's garden. Jackson found himself eating with an appetite he hadn't experienced in months. The conversation flowed easily around him, with Pearl sharing stories of her journey west and her first impressions of the territory. "It's so vast," she said, her eyes bright with wonder. "In Boston, you can hardly see the horizon for all the buildings. Here, it feels like you can see forever. Until winter comes," Harold chuckled. "Then you can't see past your own nose in a blizzard. I'm looking forward to experiencing all the seasons here," Pearl said. "Even the winters. You might change your mind when you're breaking ice in the water trough every morning," Jackson found himself saying, then immediately regretted his pessimism. But Pearl just laughed. "Perhaps. But I've always believed that difficult experiences shape us more than easy ones. Don't you think?" Jackson met her gaze across the table, struck by the unexpected wisdom in her words. "Yes," he said quietly. "I suppose they do." After dinner, while Judith served the promised apple pie, Harold brought out a bottle of good whiskey. "Special occasion," he explained, pouring a small amount into each of their glasses. "Having our daughter home and our neighbor joining us after too long away. To new beginnings," Judith proposed, raising her glass. "To new beginnings," the others echoed, though Jackson found it hard to imagine what new beginning might await him. As the evening drew to a close, Jackson realized he'd spent hours without thinking of his grief. It hadn't disappeared. He suspected it never would entirely, but for a brief time, it had receded enough to allow him to simply be present. "You'll come again next Sunday?" Judith asked as he prepared to leave. Jackson hesitated, glancing at Pearl, who was helping clear the table. "If I'm welcome." "Always," Harold assured him. "Besides, Pearl will need someone to show her around the area. She's keen to explore, and I don't have the time with Roundup coming." "I wouldn't want to impose," Jackson began, but Pearl interrupted him. "It wouldn't be an imposition at all, Mr. Miller. In fact, I'd be grateful for the guidance. Unless you're too busy with your own ranch work?" There was something in her direct gaze that made it impossible to manufacture an excuse. "I can make time," he found himself saying. "Perhaps next Saturday, if that suits?" "Perfectly," Pearl replied with a smile that somehow made the evening seem a little less dark as he rode home under the stars. True to his word, Jackson arrived at the Parker Ranch the following Saturday morning. He'd spent an embarrassing amount of time the night before cleaning his seldom-used buggy, making it presentable for a lady's comfort. When Pearl emerged from the house in a practical riding outfit rather than a dress, he realized his error. "I hope you don't mind if we ride instead of taking the buggy," she said, approaching the chestnut mare that Harold was saddling for her. "I find I see so much more from horseback." "Not at all," Jackson replied, relieved. He was far more comfortable on horseback anyway. They set out under a clear autumn sky, heading first toward town so Pearl could get her bearings. The settlement was little more than a main street with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and the newly built schoolhouse where Pearl would begin teaching in a few weeks. "It's smaller than I expected," Pearl admitted as they rode slowly down the dusty street. "It'll grow," Jackson said. "Every month brings new settlers." They continued beyond the town, with Jackson pointing out landmarks and sharing the history of the area. Pearl proved to be an attentive listener and a capable rider, easily keeping pace with him even when the terrain grew challenging. At midday, they stopped by a stream to rest the horses and eat the lunch Judith had packed for them. Jackson spread his coat on a flat rock for Pearl to sit on, and they ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, listening to the water's gentle murmur. "May I ask you something, Mr. Miller?" Pearl said finally. Jackson nodded, bracing himself for questions about Sarah or his loss. "How did you know this was where you belong? This land, I mean." The unexpected question caught him off guard. "I didn't at first," he admitted. "I came west because there was nothing for me in Pennsylvania after the war. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved my money. When I found this land, something just felt right. That's what I'm hoping to find," Pearl said thoughtfully. "A place that feels right. Boston didn't?" She shook her head. "It was where I was raised, but after my grandmother passed and left me enough money to train as a teacher, I realized I wanted something different. Something real. Teaching 20 children in a one-room schoolhouse is certainly real," Jackson said with a hint of a smile. "Probably more real than you bargained for." Pearl laughed, the sound bright against the wilderness around them. "Probably. But I'm not afraid of hard work." "No," Jackson agreed, studying her more carefully. "I don't suppose you are." They rode back as the afternoon waned, taking a different route that brought them past Jackson's ranch. He hadn't planned to show her his property, suddenly self-conscious about its modest size compared to her father's spread, but Pearl expressed interest. "Would you mind?" she asked. "I'd like to see where you live." He led her up the path to his house, seeing it through her eyes, the weathered exterior that needed painting, the garden Sarah had planted now overgrown with weeds, the emptiness of a place that had once held such promise. "It's lovely," Pearl said, surprising him. "You have a beautiful view of the mountains from here." "Sarah chose the spot," Jackson said, the words coming easier than he expected. "She said she wanted to wake up to that view every morning." Pearl's expression softened. She had good taste. They didn't linger, but as they rode away, Jackson found himself looking back at his ranch with new eyes. Not just as the site of his loss, but as the place Sarah had loved, the home they had made together, however briefly. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Jackson joined the Parkers for Sunday dinner, and on Saturdays he and Pearl explored different parts of the territory. She began teaching at the schoolhouse, throwing herself into the work with enthusiasm despite the challenges of students ranging from 5 to 15 years old, many of whom had never set foot in a classroom before. One Saturday in late October, they rode to a high meadow Jackson knew, where the autumn colors were at their peak. The aspen trees shimmered gold against the evergreens, and the distant mountains wore fresh caps of snow. "It's breathtaking," Pearl said, dismounting to better appreciate the view. "Thank you for bringing me here." Jackson watched her as she walked among the trees, reaching up to touch the fluttering leaves. There was something about her presence that made the world seem more vivid, as if she brought color back into a landscape that had faded to gray for him. "Mr. Miller," she said, turning back to him with leaves in her hair, "I think it's time you called me Pearl, don't you?" After all these expeditions, Miss Parker seems overly formal. He smiled, surprised at how natural it felt. Only if you'll call me Jackson. Jackson, she repeated, as if testing the name. It suits you. They stayed in the meadow longer than planned, talking about everything and nothing: her students, his cattle, books they'd read, places they'd been. By the time they noticed the gathering clouds, it was too late to avoid the rain that began to fall in heavy sheets. We should find shelter, Jackson called over the downpour. There's an old trapper's cabin not far from here. They rode through the rain, arriving at the small log structure just as thunder began to rumble overhead. Jackson helped Pearl dismount, both of them soaked to the skin. He led the horses to the lean-to beside the cabin while Pearl ventured inside. The cabin was basic but sound: a single room with a stone fireplace, rough wooden furniture, and a narrow bed against one wall. Jackson had stayed there occasionally when hunting or working cattle too far from home to return before nightfall. I'll get a fire started, he said, acutely aware of Pearl's presence in the confined space. There should be dry wood in that box by the hearth. Working quickly, he built a fire that soon filled the cabin with warmth and light. Pearl stood close to the flames, shivering slightly in her wet clothes. You should take that jacket off, Jackson advised, keeping his tone neutral. You'll catch your death. Pearl removed her riding jacket, hanging it on a peg near the fire. Her white blouse clung to her, and she wrapped her arms around herself self-consciously. Jackson turned away, busying himself with checking the cabin's meager supplies. There's some coffee and jerky, he reported. Not much of a meal, but it's something. Better than nothing, Pearl said, her voice steady despite her shivering. How long do you think the storm will last? Jackson listened to the rain hammering on the roof. Hard to say. These mountain storms can be unpredictable. Could pass quickly or last for hours. The implications hung in the air between them. If the storm continued into the night, they would be stranded together in this tiny cabin, a situation that would raise eyebrows back in town, to say the least. Your parents will worry, Jackson said, voicing his concern. Pearl smiled faintly. They trust you. And me. The simple statement carried weight. Harold and Judith had never expressed any misgivings about their daughter spending time alone with him, despite his being a widower almost 10 years her senior. They had extended him trust when he'd hardly trusted himself. As the afternoon wore on, the rain showed no signs of abating. They made coffee and shared the jerky, sitting on opposite sides of the small table, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jackson found himself telling Pearl about his life before Montana, his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time serving in the Union Army during the Civil War, the restlessness that had driven him west afterward. And then you met Sarah, Pearl said softly. Jackson nodded, surprised that hearing Sarah's name from Pearl's lips didn't bring the usual stab of pain. She was visiting relatives in Helena. I was delivering cattle. Saw her in the general store and couldn't look away. Love at first sight? Something like that, he admitted. Though she made me work for it. Wouldn't even let me call on her until I had proven I could provide a proper home. Pearl smiled. She sounds remarkable. She was. Jackson found himself smiling too, remembering. Strong-willed. Passionate about everything. She'd never been west of the Mississippi before meeting me, but she took to ranch life like she was born to it. You must miss her terribly. Every day, Jackson said honestly. But lately. He paused, struggling to articulate the change. Lately, I've started to remember the good more than the loss. I think she'd be glad of that. Pearl reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. I'm sure she would. Outside, the storm continued to rage, making the decision for them. They would have to stay the night. Jackson insisted Pearl take the bed while he would sleep on the floor near the fire. I can't put you out of a bed in your own cabin, Pearl protested. It's not really mine, Jackson countered. And I've slept on harder ground than this. Eventually she relented, and Jackson made her as comfortable as possible with the single blanket and his own coat for additional warmth. He settled himself by the fire, using his saddle as a pillow, conscious of Pearl's presence just a few feet away. "Jackson?" Her voice came softly through the darkness. "Thank you for today. For all the Saturdays. They've meant a great deal to me." "To me as well," he replied, realizing the truth of it as he spoke. Morning came with clear skies and birdsong. They returned to the Parker Ranch by mid-morning, where Harold and Judith were indeed concerned but understanding once the situation was explained. "These things happen in mountain country," Harold said, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully on Jackson. As fall deepened into winter, Jackson found himself drawn more and more to the Parker home. Not just for Sunday dinners, but for evenings by the fire, listening to Pearl read aloud from one of her books, or helping Harold with winter preparations around the ranch. The Parker's home became a second home to him, filling a void he hadn't fully acknowledged. Pearl, for her part, seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. She sought his advice about her more challenging students, shared her ideas for improving the school, and listened attentively when he spoke of his ranch and his plans for expanding his herd in the spring. It was Judith who finally brought the unspoken to light. One Sunday in early December, while Pearl was upstairs changing for dinner and Harold was checking on a pregnant mare, Judith cornered Jackson in the parlor. "You care for her, don't you?" she asked directly. Jackson felt heat rise in his face. "Mrs. Parker, Judith, please. After all these months, I think we're past formalities." He nodded, gathering his thoughts. "Yes, I care for her. More than I expected to. More than I had any right to." "Why do you say that?" Judith asked, her expression gentle. "She's young. Educated. She could have any future she chooses. And I'm—" He trailed off, unable to voice his doubts. "A good man who has known sorrow," Judith finished for him. "A man my daughter admires greatly." Jackson looked up sharply. "Has she said something?" "She doesn't have to. A mother knows." Judith patted his arm. "I'm not telling you what to do, Jackson. But don't let fear keep you from happiness." Not again. Before he could respond, Pearl descended the stairs, and the moment passed. But Judith's words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he rode home that night under a sky brilliant with stars. The following Saturday, a blizzard kept them from their usual ride. Jackson spent the day repairing tack in his barn, trying not to think about how much he missed seeing Pearl. By Sunday, the storm had cleared enough for him to make it to the Parkers for dinner, but the roads to town remained impassable. "The children will be thrilled with an unexpected holiday," Pearl said, though she looked concerned. "But I worry about making up the lost time. Some of the older boys are just starting to show real progress with their reading. Maybe you could assign them independent work," Jackson suggested. "For when school resumes." Pearl brightened. "That's an excellent idea. I could prepare packets for each student. But how to deliver them?" "I could help," Jackson offered. "My ranch is closer to town than yours. If you prepare the materials, I could take them to your students once the worst of the snow clears." "Would you?" "That would be wonderful." Her smile made something in his chest tighten. The next morning, Pearl rode over to Jackson's ranch with a satchel full of books and papers. It was the first time she had come to his home alone, and he felt a strange nervousness as he watched her approach. "I hope I'm not imposing," she said as he helped her dismount. "But I took you at your word about the school materials." "Of course," he assured her. "Come inside where it's warm while I stable your horse." When he entered the house a few minutes later, he found Pearl standing in the middle of the main room, looking around with interest. The house was cleaner and more orderly than it had been during her first visit months ago. He'd started caring again about his home, about himself. "I made coffee," she said, gesturing to the pot on the stove. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all." He poured them each a cup, and they sat at the kitchen table where Pearl had spread out her teaching materials. "I've prepared something different for each student based on their abilities," she explained, showing him the carefully labeled packets. "The Thompson twins are just learning their letters, while John Abernathy is ready for basic arithmetic. Jackson listened, admiring her dedication and the thoughtfulness she brought to her teaching. "You're making a real difference for these children," he said when she paused. "Many of them wouldn't have any education otherwise." Pearl blushed slightly at the praise. "I hope so. It matters to me that they have opportunities, regardless of where they were born or their circumstances. That's one of the things I admire most about you," Jackson said, the words coming before he could reconsider them. "Your belief that people can become more than their beginnings." Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. Pearl's blush deepened, and she looked down at her papers. "Thank you," she said softly. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Pearl cleared her throat and returned to explaining the assignments, and Jackson forced himself to focus on the task at hand. They spent the morning organizing the materials and planning the best route to reach all 15 of Pearl's students, scattered as they were across the surrounding countryside. By the time they finished, the winter sun was high in the sky, casting bright rectangles of light across the wooden floor. "I should get back," Pearl said, though she made no move to rise. "My parents will be expecting me." "Of course," Jackson agreed, equally stationary. "Though there's stew on the stove if you're hungry before you go." Pearl hesitated, then smiled. "That sounds wonderful, actually. If you're sure it's no trouble." "No trouble at all." They ate at the kitchen table, the domesticity of the scene striking Jackson with unexpected force. How long had it been since he'd shared a meal with someone in this house? Since laughter had filled these rooms? After they finished eating, Pearl insisted on helping with the dishes despite his protests. They worked side by side at the sink, her sleeve occasionally brushing his arm, each contact sending a jolt through him that he tried to ignore. "Jackson," Pearl said suddenly, her hands stilling in the dishwater. "May I ask you something personal?" He tensed but nodded. "Of course. Are you happy? Or at least, happier than when we first met?" The question caught him off guard with its directness and perception. He considered it carefully before answering. "Yes," he said finally. "I am. Not in the same way as before, but yes. There's room for it again, somehow." Pearl nodded, her eyes searching his face. "I'm glad. You deserve happiness." "So do you," he replied. "Are you? Happy here, I mean?" "Happier than I expected to be," she admitted with a small smile. "Though I miss certain things about city life. The theaters. Libraries. Bookshops. Not enough culture in our little corner of Montana?" he teased gently. Pearl laughed. "It's not that. There's culture here, just different. And there are compensations." Her eyes met his again, and the implication hung in the air between them. Before he could respond, a knock at the door broke the moment. It was Harold, come to escort his daughter home before the light faded. "Thought I might find you here," he said, his expression neutral as he took in the domestic scene. "Roads are getting icy again. Best we head back while we can." Pearl gathered her things, leaving behind the packets for Jackson to deliver. At the door, she turned back to him. "Thank you for today. For everything." "My pleasure," Jackson replied, meaning it more than she could know. As winter deepened, Jackson found himself spending more and more time at the Parker Ranch. The blizzards that periodically closed the school gave Pearl unexpected free days, and they often used these to continue exploring the territory, now transformed into a winter wonderland. They went ice fishing on the frozen lake, took the Parker sleigh into town for supplies, and once ventured all the way to Helena for a Christmas concert that Pearl had read about in the territorial newspaper. It was during the return journey from Helena, as they huddled together under buffalo robes in Harold's big sleigh with Judith and Harold riding ahead in a smaller one, that Jackson finally found the courage to speak of what had been growing between them. "Pearl," he began, his voice barely audible over the runner's hiss against the snow. "I've been thinking a lot about what your mother said to me a few weeks ago." Pearl looked at him curiously. "What did she say?" "That I shouldn't let fear keep me from happiness." He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry despite the cold. She was right. I've been afraid of feeling too much, of losing again. Of not being enough for someone like you. Someone like me? Pearl repeated, her eyes wide in the fading light. Yes. You're extraordinary. Smart, kind, brave. You could have stayed in Boston, lived a comfortable life. Instead, you came here to make a difference. Jackson took a deep breath. What I'm trying to say, Pearlie, is that I care for you. More than I thought possible. And if you could consider. That is, if you might feel something similar. He was making a mess of it, fumbling for words that wouldn't come. But then Pearl's gloved hand found his beneath the robes, and she smiled at him with such warmth that the words no longer seemed to matter. I do, she said simply. I have for some time now. Relief and joy flooded through him. You have? Pearl nodded. From almost the beginning, I think. But I didn't want to presume or to rush you. I know how much Sarah meant to you, how much she always will. She would have liked you, Jackson said, the realization striking him as undoubtedly true. She always said life was for living, even when it's hard. Especially then. Pearl squeezed his hand. Wise words. Pearl, I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in mine. If you'll have me. Is that a proposal, Jackson Miller? Her tone was light, but her eyes were serious. I suppose it is, he replied, suddenly certain. Not very romantic, I'm afraid. On the contrary, Pearl said softly. I think it's perfectly romantic. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, her lips warm against his cold ones, and for the first time in nearly a year, Jackson felt truly alive. They were married in the spring of 1877, when the wildflowers carpeted the meadows and the mountains had shed their winter white for verdant green. The ceremony was held outdoors, on a plateau overlooking both the Parker Ranch and Jackson's smaller spread. Reverend Thompson officiated, and it seemed to Jackson that the old man's eyes were especially bright when he pronounced them husband and wife. The entire settlement turned out for the celebration, afterward ranchers and townspeople, Pearl's students and their families, even a few travelers who happened to be passing through. Tables groaned with food, fiddles played late into the night, and if anyone disapproved of the schoolteacher marrying the widower, they kept it to themselves. Are you happy? Jackson asked Pearl as they danced under the stars, her white dress glowing in the moonlight. Completely, she assured him, her eyes reflecting the joy he felt. And you? More than I ever thought possible again, he replied honestly. Later, when they were alone in what was now their home, Jackson watched as Pearl moved around the rooms, adding small touches she had brought with her, books on the shelves, a colorful quilt across the back of the sofa, a vase of fresh flowers on the table. Is it strange? He asked. Being here, knowing this was our home, Sarah's and mine? Pearl considered the question thoughtfully. Not strange, she decided. Sacred, perhaps. This house holds your history, your memories. I wouldn't want to erase that. She came to stand before him, taking his hands in hers. But now we'll make new memories alongside the old ones. That's how life works, isn't it? The past and present coexisting, making us who we are. Jackson pulled her close, marveling at the wisdom and compassion of the woman he married. How did I get so lucky twice in one lifetime? Not luck, Pearl murmured against his chest. Just love finding its way home. In the years that followed, the Miller Ranch flourished. Jackson expanded his herd and his acreage, eventually buying the adjacent property when old man Simmons decided to move back east. Pearl continued teaching until their first child arrived, a daughter they named Hope, who had her mother's chestnut hair and her father's quiet determination. 2 more children followed, James, named for Jackson's father, and Sarah, a tribute that Pearl had suggested and that Jackson accepted with grateful tears. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with children's laughter, with music from the piano Pearl had insisted on having shipped from St. Louis, with the everyday sounds of a family living fully. Pearl never returned to formal teaching, but she held classes at the ranch for their children and any neighbors who wanted to join. The front room became an informal library, with books lining every available wall and often spilling onto tables and chairs. Jackson built additional shelves, pretending to grumble about all these books taking over, but secretly delighting in Pearl's passion for learning and her determination to pass it on to their children. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked her one evening, nearly 10 years after their wedding. The children were asleep, and they sat on the porch watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the valley. "Staying here instead of returning to the city? You could have had a different life." Pearl considered this, her head resting against his shoulder. "I could have had a different life," she agreed. "But not a better one." She looked up at him, her face softened by the years but still beautiful to him, still bright with that inner light that had first drawn him to her. "Everything I need is right here." Jackson tightened his arm around her, overwhelmed as always by the gift of her love. "Even without theaters and libraries and bookshops?" Pearl laughed. "Well, we do make it to Helena once a year for the theater. And I have my books. And as for libraries," she gestured toward the house where their collection had long since outgrown the shelves, "I'd say we've created our own." Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the land that had become their shared legacy, the ranch house with its additions built for their growing family, the barn where Hope's mare had recently foaled, the schoolroom Jackson had constructed when Pearl's informal classes grew too large for the front room, the orchards they planted together their first spring as husband and wife. "We've built something good here," Jackson said, as much to himself as to Pearl. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Something that will last." And it did. Through hard winters and summer droughts, through the territory's transition to statehood, through the changes that the turn of the century brought to even their remote corner of Montana, the Miller Ranch stood as a testament to resilience and renewal. To the power of love to heal what seemed broken beyond repair. To the possibility of second chances when least expected. Jackson never forgot Sarah or the brief, bright love they had shared. Her portrait hung in the parlor alongside newer family photographs, and he told their children stories of the brave young woman who had first made this house a home. Pearl encouraged these remembrances, understanding that his capacity to love again had grown from the depth of his first love, not in spite of it. As their children grew and the 20th century dawned, bringing automobiles and telephones even to their rural community, Jackson sometimes marveled at the journey that had brought him here. From the depths of grief to the heights of joy, from solitude to the rich complexity of family life, from a cold, dark house to one warmed by Pearl's presence and the legacy they were creating together. On their 30th anniversary, with their children grown and the first grandchildren beginning to visit the ranch each summer, Jackson took Pearl back to the meadow where they had sheltered from the storm all those years ago. The trapper's cabin was still there, though now it served as an occasional retreat for them when they needed time alone together away from the demands of the ranch. "Did you ever imagine that day that we would end up here?" Pearl asked as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Jackson shook his head. "I couldn't see past the next day back then. Couldn't imagine wanting to. And now?" He turned to look at her, this woman who had brought light back into his world when he thought it extinguished forever. "Now I can't imagine any life but this one. With you." Pearl's eyes, still that same clear blue though now crinkled at the corners with laugh lines, filled with tears. "Nor can I." As twilight deepened around them and the first stars appeared overhead, Jackson reflected on the mysterious workings of fate that had brought Pearl to Montana at exactly the moment he needed her most. Not to replace what he had lost, but to remind him that the heart's capacity for love is limitless. That even in the midst of grief, seeds of new joy can take root. That a house gone cold can be warmed again by the right presence. "Thank you," he said simply, taking Pearl's hand in his. She didn't ask what for. She didn't need to. After 3 decades together, words were often unnecessary between them. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they watched night claim the land they both loved, secure in the knowledge that whatever darkness might come, they would face it together. And that was light enough.